Hello, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. We still have a few people coming in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our webinar today. Today, we will be presenting the second of a two-part series, how to assess your CER for MDR readiness. This installment is titled Clinical Data Sources, Risk-Benefit Analysis, and Overall Analyses and Conclusions. My name is Mark Grondin, and I will be your host for today, and I'm COO of Criterion Edge. Before we get started, I want to run a few housekeeping items by you to make sure that you can get the most out of this webinar. Number one, if you experience any technical difficulties, such as sound issues or anything else, please send us a message through the chat option below your screen, and we'll do our best to resolve it as quickly as possible. Second, if you have any questions about the content today that you'd like to address to Lori, please type them into the Q&A option in your Zoom menu bar, and we'll run through as many of the questions as we can following Lori's presentation. If we are unable to answer your question in the duration of this webinar, we'll attempt to reach out to you with the answer following the webinar. You can always feel free to contact us with the contact information at the end of the webinar as well. Lastly, the webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on demand after the presentation. All right, the topic will be presented by Lori Mitchell today, the founder and president of Criterion Edge. Lori Mitchell is a global medical and regulatory, or Criterion Edge, sorry, is a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori is our founder and president at Criterion Edge. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety, and pharmacovigilance management and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she's a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. Before we get started, I want to read this quick disclaimer. The information presented in this webinar is based upon our experience writing many MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4 and MDR-compliant CERs for notified body review. The opinions, tips, and best practices presented here are our interpretation and do not represent opinions or decisions that may be made by a notified body. The information is conceptual, as each clinical evaluation process is unique to this subject device. We hope you find the information useful and applicable to your own internal processes. And with that, we're going to go ahead and launch our first poll question of the session. So if you'll bear with me, we'll launch this poll. I want to note that there are two questions in this poll that you should see on your screen. And we just ask you to answer these questions, and we'll, after about a minute or so, I'll close the poll and we'll review the results. So if you have any questions finding the poll on your screen, go ahead and type it into the chat menu, but it looks like quite a few, at least 20 or 30% have answered so far. So we'll just give it another 30 seconds, and then we'll quickly review the poll results to show what our audience is today. All right, we have good participation. We have about 65% participation so far. Another 15 seconds. All right, thank you all for participating. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll, and we can look at the results here to describe our audience. So today we have about 47% of our audience are regulatory affairs quality professionals, and then next biggest group are clinical affairs, clinical science professionals, followed by medical writers and other. In terms of how aligned processes are with MDR requirements, about 57% say there's a work in progress, which is by far the largest result, followed by they have solid processes and documents in place that will be updated. All right, so You all should see those notes on your screen. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it to Lori and let her get started in the presentation. Lori?
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone to the second presentation in a two-part series on assessing your CER for MDR readiness. In our session today, a reminder that the information presented here is from the point of view of seasoned CER medical writers. Since 2016, our team has performed gap analyses on many poorly written CERs, and before too long, we began to detect common themes to those gaps. Today, I will present strategies gleaned from our experience for assessing these critical components of your CER for possible misalignment with key MDR requirements. This is a practical presentation which hopefully will help you assess and thus mitigate your own CER processes and document for possible gaps prior to submission to regulatory authorities. In this webinar, we will identify key review strategies to assess a CER for common gaps found in the clinical data sources subsections, that is the clinical literature, PMS, PMCF, and clinical investigation data, the risk-benefit analysis, and finally, ensuring the clinical evaluation report is tied together with clear analyses and conclusions. Before we begin, I thought it might be useful to go back through a quick high-level review of the key takeaways from part 1 of this series, where we looked at the state-of-the-art, systematic literature review, safety and performance objectives, and equivalence. By the way, you can access the recording of this webinar by visiting the resources page on our website at www.criterionedge.com. Let's take a look. A well-written state-of-the-art should tell the story of the current knowledge and state-of-the-art treatment options related to the subject device under evaluation. Through the analysis of clinical data from the competitive landscape, relevant safety and performance requirements, or SPRs, and their quantifiable acceptance criteria are identified. These SPRs and the upper and lower bounds of the acceptance criteria become the defining measures of the state-of-the-art standard against which your device will be compared. The methodology of the SOA literature review should be clearly presented and focus only on the competitive landscape. Ensure that the story flows logically, beginning with the clinical conditions related to all indications for the subject device and moving to available treatment options and maturity of technology. Remember, device-specific data does not belong in the state-of-the-art. SLR methodology documents the process of the identification, retrieval, selection, appraisal, and weighting of published clinical data pertaining to either the subject device or the competitor data presented in the state-of-the-art section. This methodology must be documented in such a way that it is transparent and reproducible and shows that selection bias has been minimized. Be sure not to commingle the methodology and results for the state-of-the-art and competitive landscape searches with the subject device search. Ensure all required documentation is clearly organized and explained. The purpose of the SPRs is to establish key endpoint outcomes which are measurable by quantifiable acceptance criteria. These are derived through the analysis of the competitive landscape data in the state-of-the-art section. Those criteria should be valid, relevant, measurable, and cover all indications. The CER must document how they were identified through the analysis of the competitive landscape data and how they will be used as measures for evaluating the safety and performance of the subject device. The methodology should cite applicable requirements such as GSPR and describe the process used to establish these measurable safety and performance objectives and acceptance criteria. Again, a reminder Safety and performance objectives and the acceptance criteria must be established using competitive landscape data analyzed in the state-of-the-art section. Equivalence. The purpose of an equivalence argument is singular and quite straightforward: to establish that the subject device under evaluation is fully equivalent to the comparator device. Methodology must show an unambiguous head-to-head comparison of each clinical, technical, and biological device characteristic. For each variant that is not the same, there must be an analysis of the differences and a clear justification of the acceptability and clinical impact of those differences. Organize the equivalence section using easy-to-follow tables, assess each characteristic as same or similar, and perform a gap analysis of the differences. In summary, for CERs that involve equivalence, the focus should be on the gap analysis, all differences justified and conclusions clearly stated. That wraps up the recap of information presented in the first presentation. A quick reminder that you can access the full recording on our website. Now let's take a look at the first topic for today's presentation, clinical data sources. In part one of this series, we did a deep dive into the process and methodology of conducting a systematic literature review. In other words, the collection of published clinical data. Here today, we will examine the presentation and analysis of each clinical data set in a CER, which usually includes those data identified from published literature and other publicly available sources, such as registries. PMS data passively collected through post-market surveillance processes. PMCF data derived from proactive post-market data collection activities conducted by the manufacturer. And finally, manufacturer-held clinical investigation data. Excuse me. The purpose of the clinical data included in the CER, again, is clear: to demonstrate that there is sufficient clinical evidence to establish the safety and performance as intended of the subject device or devices under evaluation. But there's a lot packed into that relatively straightforward statement, which I know you have questions about. For example, what exactly is the measure of data sufficiency? Or how do you identify key safety and performance standards? And don't forget, the data sufficiency standard must be met for all device indications. The methodology on how clinical data sets are identified, weighted, and appraised must be documented. Be sure to establish the relevance of each data set to the subject device. Ideally, data cut time ranges should be consistent across all data sources used in the CER. Each source of the clinical data must be presented in its own section. Do not commingle the presentation and analysis of different types or sources of clinical data. Finally, because each data set presented in the CER must be analyzed against the SPRs and acceptance criteria, this means you cannot simply cut and paste analysis and conclusion statements that may have been taken from another internal document, such as the current PMS report or a CSR. Those analyses are not relevant to the analysis required in the CER. We begin with common observations noted in CERs that we've conducted MDR gap analyses on. And by the way, each of the following sections that are coming up will be set up using this same format of observations and suggested revisions. With regards to the presentation of clinical data from published literature, some observations we've seen are the information or data derived from each included article is not logically presented or well organized in easy to follow tables, which can make it difficult for the reviewer to be able to trace the information back to its published source. And you'll hear me say this general theme throughout this presentation. We want to make things obvious for the notified body reviewer. It should be easy, logical, well organized, so that the notified body doesn't have to dig for information or skip around. You'll hear me sort of say that over and over again, so keep that in mind. The documentation of the clinical literature search and review methodology is incomplete or unclear. There can be sometimes a question of duplication of reported data presented in the CSR. This can happen in a few ways. When there is an overlap with the manufacturer-held clinical investigation data reported in one section of the CER, while perhaps the corresponding published article using the same data has not been screened out during the literature search, resulting in the data are inadvertently reported again in that section, so twice. Another version of this data duplication scenario is double counting the same data published by multiple authors in different papers. Perhaps a subset of the data was published to address alternate research questions, which may still result in a duplication or a double counting effect. And lastly, the overall data analysis lacks specificity, or even worse, the analysis and conclusions are not supported by the data. Suggested revisions to address these issues would be to consider adopting a clear and consistent format for the presentation of included published clinical data to help with readability and tracing. I suggest short literature critiques presented in a tabular format that allows for a focused, comprehensive, and easy to follow presentation of the data. Include summary tables that provide an overview of all included studies and their contribution to the evaluation. Clearly present the literature search screening and review methodology, the exclusion criteria, and as an appendix, the list of excluded articles. That's more of a methodology comment there. And finally, be sure to include a summary analysis of the clinical data consisting of a tabular presentation of outcomes with rate ranges. This is getting to the acceptance criteria and the SPRs. This facilitates a comparison of the clinical data derived from the clinical literature with the SPRs and the acceptance criteria identified in the state-of-the-art competitor analysis. We'll talk about this again, is that with each PMS is coming up now, with each data set, you're going to want to analyze the data against those SPRs. So here with PMS and PMCF data, first, an observation that we've noted in several CERs, that there is a general misunderstanding, or can be a general misunderstanding, of what constitutes PMCF data. Pre-market clinical investigation data and post-market complaint data are not post-market clinical follow-up data. PMCF data are those data that are proactively collected by the manufacturer as described in their PMCF plan. Other common findings. The PMS data presentation lacks analysis. In other words, it might be a listing of raw complaint data or overall sales figures with little or no sub-analysis to give the data meaning or applicability to SPRs and acceptance criteria. Similarly, harms are listed but not analyzed relative to each subject device or the SPRs. Adequate justification for planned PMCF collection activities may be missing, or there may be no cross-reference back to that PMCF plan. Finally, even if PMS and PMCF data are adequately reported with appropriate sub-analysis, one step is often missing. The data sets must be weighted and appraised just like all other clinical data presented in the CER. Suggested revisions. Analyze the raw data by performing relevant sub-analysis calculations, such as occurrence rates versus market share or competitor data, complaint rates as compared to overall sales, to name just a few examples. Cross-reference to the PMS or PMCF plan and restate the justification if no PMCF data collection activities are underway. Be sure to include a summary of the PMCF strategy as described in the PMCF plan. Do not commingle data sources. Present PMS data separately from the PMCF data if you have it. Remember that PMS and PMCF data must be analyzed against the SPRs. There's that broken record again I warned you about. Against SPRs and acceptance criteria, just as all other sources of clinical data must be. Because PMS and PMCF data are manufacturer held, these data can usually be appraised and weighted at the highest level of evidence. Of course, clinical data derived from manufacturer-sponsored clinical investigation meets the gold standard with regards to the highest level of evidence. If this data is available, you want to ensure it is effectively presented in the CER. However, this is not always the case. Some of our observations here have been, there's no mention or reference to the clinical development plan relevant to the study device. For MDR compliance, if you have not yet developed a CDP, you should consider doing that soon. Beware cutting and pasting large sections from the latest CSR into the CER. That is not the most effective way to present information and data. Be sure to summarize key study information such as methods, endpoints, and study conclusions, either interim or final, and present the relevant outcome data in a tabular format. In other words, you need to make the data understandable in the context of the CER. It's not just an easy drag and drop from the CSR over into the CER. There's no summary table that provides an overview of all included studies and their contribution to the evaluation. This really helps give the reviewer a lay of the land when evaluating the information in this section. As I mentioned earlier, be mindful that there is a risk of presenting duplicate data across subsections of the CER's clinical data sources section. Here we go again. You may be detecting a theme by now, but reminder that all clinical data must be analyzed against the SPRs and acceptance criteria. Suggested revisions include: make tables. List all manufacturer-sponsored studies relevant to the subject device in a summary table, and include information on some study methods, endpoint data, and conclusions for each clinical investigation. Appraise and analyze the data using the same methodology across all data sources. For clinical investigation studies with overlap, remember I talked about that earlier, for clinical investigation studies that may have overlap in the clinical literature, this section wins. Present those data here and simply cross-reference if there is a corresponding published article back in the clinical literature section. Right now, I think I'm going to give it back to Mark because I think we have another poll question.
Thank you, Lori. I just launched our second poll. That question is, what are the biggest challenges faced by you or your company for MDR readiness? And while you go ahead and answer that, I'll just take this time to remind you that this is also a good time to put your questions into the Q&A section available in the Zoom menu bar, and Lori will be addressing those questions following the presentation. So with that, we'll just give it another, let's say 20 seconds to let everyone answer this poll, and then we'll move on. All right, we have about half the audience has answered. We'll give you another 15 seconds or so. All right, looks like we had good poll participation as well. I'm gonna go ahead and share the results here. As you can see, we have actually answers all over the board, with the most common being people resources being the biggest challenge. Need more bandwidth to get all the work done. And then followed by knowledge gaps, as well as major overhauls and priorities. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll, and we'll hand it back to Lori.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks everyone for weighing in on that poll question. I hope you noticed that it was a check all that apply, and no fair checking them all. But we also recognize that you may have checked multiple ones. We really wanted to know where folks were feeling their pain points. Thanks a lot for filling that poll question out. Next, we'll review the risk-benefit analysis section. Based on our experience, it is possible, in our experience, to devote an entire presentation only on the RBA section of the CER. Simply put, in our opinion, the risk-benefit analysis section is where the results of the entire clinical evaluation come together. The SPRs and acceptance criteria derived from the state-of-the-art analysis, the analysis of clinical data from all sources. All of this information is synthesized in the risk-benefit analysis section to complete the story. That is, to demonstrate the acceptability of the risk-benefit profile of the device. In other words, the last piece of the puzzle, if you will. Methodology includes a description of internal risk management activities, excuse me, a listing of applicable regulations and internal SOPs, a listing of each benefit and risk identified in the analysis of clinical data, and a cross-reference to that original source. Be sure to compare all findings to the SPRs. As with regards to organization, separate risk and benefit discussions and analysis. Do not commingle those. Tie it all together with one overall conclusion as to the acceptability of the subject device risk-benefit profile. Some common observations here are the information presented into this critical section of the CER feeds directly out of the internal risk-benefit processes that are currently in place within the company. So a quick disclaimer is, if those processes are not well defined and internally well executed, it could be a struggle to ensure the information presented in this section aligns with MDR expectations. Some common gap analysis observations include there is inadequate detail on internal risk management activities and risk assessment methodology. It's unclear, excuse me, it's unclear if the risk profile of the subject device was updated with any new risk information gleaned from the review of published clinical literature. In other words, is a feedback loop in place that ensures any new risk information identified during the clinical literature review was fed back into internal risk management processes for updates. The presentation and analysis of both the benefits and risks is generally disorganized or difficult to follow. Worse than that, the conclusion for a favorable risk-benefit assessment is not supported by the synthesis of clinical data presented in other sections. Certainly, this is a problematic finding, which we have seen before. Lastly, there is no definitive conclusion statement, which simply states the acceptability of the risk-benefit profile of the device under evaluation. In other words, going back to my comment earlier, we need to make it sometimes easy or obvious on the reviewer. Tell the reviewer form the conclusions for the reviewer. They'll ultimately decide, but state it for them. Instead of having them draw their own conclusions, make it plain that, equivalence is met. The acceptability of the risk-benefit profile. Say that out loud. And then, of course, it has to be backed up by your analysis. Suggested revisions. Details matter. Break it down for the reviewer. Provide details and a short description of the risk management processes in place within your company. State that these risk management procedures were adhered to for this clinical evaluation. And there should be a point-by-point presentation and discussion of the contribution of all available clinical data to the overall risk-benefit analysis. This is why I said that this is a very large section, and because it's where everything comes together. There should be a point-by-point presentation and discussion of the contribution of all available clinical data to the overall risk-benefit analysis. I repeated that for a reason. It's a dense sentence. Determine the acceptability of the risk-benefit profile for all indications and for all intended purposes. Stating has been on the market for X number of years is not an acceptable justification. And finally, as I said, clearly include a definitive conclusion statement of the acceptability of the risk-benefit profile of the device under evaluation. Here we are at the final step, ensuring that you've tied it all together with analyses and conclusions. I thought I would start this section with a statement taken directly from MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4. The clinical evaluation report should contain sufficient information to be read and understood by an independent party, e.g. regulatory authority or notified body. So, when evaluating your own CER, ask yourself these questions. Is there sufficient information? Can the report be read and understood by an independent third party? Someone who does not necessarily know or love your company's devices as you do. Sufficiency and understandability. Perhaps those should be the two guiding benchmarks to assess your CER against: sufficiency and understandability. Moving on to the common observations. There can be no doubt that the CER is a very, very complex report to organize and write. So I will start this discussion by first revealing a personal bias. In my opinion, it takes a talented writer to prepare, organize, and present clinical and technical data derived from disparate data sets, analyze those data sets against complex safety and performance criteria, and finally draw scientifically sound conclusions as to the acceptability of the device under evaluation. This is not a task that can be easily accomplished by an uninitiated writer. Many of our gap analyses observations have to do with presentation and organizational issues that are built right into the CER itself. Unclear presentation of clinical data, which may result in faulty or poorly documented conclusions. Poor readability, which is also directly related to the unclear presentation of information. This can result in inadequate analyses and, again, faulty conclusions. All data sets may not be analyzed against applicable SPRs and acceptance criteria. Discussions lack specificity or data support, or clear summary statements may be missing. And finally, there is no summary conclusion statement that establishes the subject device as the state of the art, and or that all applicable requirements have been met in this evaluation. Those are two critical bottom line statements that should be in every CER. Suggested revisions could be to critically evaluate the device's previous CER or your CER template and update as needed to meet all relevant guidelines, and readability and understandability certainly. Establish device-specific and robust SPRs and acceptance criteria with quantifiable upper and lower bounds. Apply the highest standards of scientific rigor to all elements of the clinical evaluation process and report. And finally, ensure the overall conclusion is supported by the section summary conclusions. Well, this marks the end of our presentation today. Thank you all for attending, and I'll hand it back to Mark to open it up for our remaining time for questions.
Thank you, Lori. We hope at this point you have a clear understanding of, one, how to assess your clinical evaluation process and the CER document for possible gaps, and two, how to document organization, methodology, and clearly stated conclusions are critical to the success of your CER. If not, this is the time to submit your questions. So please use the Q&A option in your Zoom menu to submit those questions. And it looks like we already have some questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to our question and answer screen and share the first question. So Lori, the first question is, can we use a device, equivalent device, for technical and clinical comparison and another device, benchmark device, for biological comparison under the MDR?
The short answer is no. And I assume that, yes, so this is an equivalence question. And the short answer, which I hope most of us on the call are aware of by now, is that you must have, if you have an equivalent comparator, it must be one device, and you must have basically full access to the technical file of that device in order to do a line-by-line comparison of each device characteristic.
All right, thank you. Or the second question that we have is equivalence mandatory if there's not a direct comparative device?
No, equivalence isn't mandatory ever. It is an optional section, and it's mandatory only when the subject device under evaluation, there is a concern or it doesn't have sufficient clinical evidence to support data to support an evaluation on its own, that it needs to be able to establish equivalent with perhaps a predecessor device so that A equals B and the data derived for A can be applied to subject device B.
Excellent. We have another question on equivalence. This one is, for equivalence data, how can we assess technical files for devices as they are companies' confidential documents, especially when comparing with other competitors?
I don't know a lot about that. There would be, again, another equivalence question here, and that would be through, as far as I understand it, we have never worked with a company that has had those kinds of agreements with a competitor company, but my understanding is it requires contracts and a lot of agreements.
Excellent. Our next question on a different subject is, should there be more than one resource for literature searches?
One resource, I take that to mean as more than one database is searched. And if that, I hope that's the intent of the question. And if it's database, yes, there should be. And there commonly is. In fact, MedDev Rev 4 actually gives a shout out to Embase and Medline as common sources of searches. And we have a systematic literature review team because we do so many of them, and we operate on a platform called ProQuest Dialogue, where you can enter in very robust search mesh terminology, search syntax and strategies. And our go-to databases are Embase and Medline.
All right, let's go to our next question. Another topic. Risk management activities can be huge. What should be included in the CER?
That is a huge question. So risk management activities are huge. This is a big topic, and generally how we approach it is that we go through we describe in detail the risk-benefit methodology and assessments. Harms are usually listed. Other recent, like an RMS report, is put in there. And any kind of reporting that the company does on a routine basis for their risk management activities, that data is put in there. And then probably the most important part is that there is a fairly large section of the RBA section of the CER. A large portion of that section is spent on a head-to-head analysis of each risk and each benefit identified in all the clinical data sets. In other words, we'll have a table that can go on sometimes for a few pages, line by line listing. If a benefit is listed in a clinical literature source, or there was a risk identified in 3 different clinical literature sources, and we'll reference those and reference back to the RMS and assessment. So it is like I said, this is a very high level answer, and I know it probably leaves the questioner with more questions than answers. But this is a big section of the CER, and in our opinion, this is where the argument is made or broken. The conclusion section of the CER, which comes after the RBA, is basically a large and complex summarization of what the reviewer has already read. But the RBA section is where it all comes together and the final analysis and argument is made.
Excellent. We're getting good range on questions here. Our next one is the CDP a standalone document? Are there guidances for it?
The CDP is a standalone document. Honestly, I am not clear if there are regulatory guidances on dictating a CDP template for the CDPs that we've written for several of our clients. They come with a template. They look slightly different between client to client, I will say that. But it's generally a description of the background and the clinical development of the device up to that point, and it's revved yearly, I believe, with new CSR data or other new development activities. But it is definitely a standalone document.
Excellent. Our next question, another topic area, does the SSCP requirement only apply to MDR certified medical devices?
This is where I always use my common disclaimer and say we are not regulatory affairs professionals. We're subject matter experts on the documents, SSCP being one of them. In our experience, the SSCP we've only ever developed an SSCP for MDR, a companion doc. It's a companion document essentially to an MDR CER. So in our experience, we have not developed an SSCP for an MDD CER. And of course, I'll just add one more thing. Of course, not all devices require an SSCP, and I would encourage you, of course, to check the guidelines with the requirements for what class of device and the attributes of the device demand an SSCP, and especially demand the patient section of the SSCP.
Excellent. We're going to go ahead and take a quick pause give Lori a quick break from answering the questions and put up our third poll and final poll of the session. I'm going to go ahead and launch that. And the question is, after this webinar, how confident in your internal clinical evaluation processes MDR readiness are you? 1 being not at all confident and 10 being extremely confident. I'll go ahead and share that with the group as soon as we're done. We're going to give it again about a minute in total to get some responses in. We're getting responses in pretty quickly. Again, if you have any other questions for Lori, you can also take this time to type those into the Q&A section in your Zoom webinar toolbar, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. Hopefully we can get through most of the questions. We do have a lot coming in, which is great. I'll give you about 15 more seconds to answer this one, then we'll share the results. All right, go ahead and share these results here. It looks like, Lori, you're having some success here. We've got the best, or the biggest group is on an 8 out of 10 in terms of confidence, and then the second biggest group is 7 out of 10. So it seems like most of this group is fairly confident, which is great. We go ahead and stop sharing those results, and we're going to move on to our next question. Lori, the next question is, if we have sufficient clinical data from published sources, do we still need to have an equivalent device?
No, That's a pretty straightforward. If you feel like the clinical data from published sources, any source of clinical data, remember PMS data, PMCF data count as well. If you feel like you have sufficient clinical data to establish the safety and performance as intended of your medical device, an equivalence section should not be required. I have I see in the chat box that there's a response from one of our attendees that says the CEP is a standalone document, not the CDP. Certainly the CEP, the Clinical Evaluation Plan, is a standalone document that is submitted as part of your MDR, usually, submission. The CDP, what I meant by a standalone document is that it's not required for MDR submission per se, but the notified bodies are beginning to look at for CDPs, internal CDPs, for the source of the information about the clinical development of the device. So they're beginning to ask for references back to the CDP about where we're getting information in the CER. So they consider the CDP a feeder document, essentially, to the CER, but it is not, the CDP is not required for submission to a notified body, but the notified body may request to see it upon their review.
Excellent. We go back to another area we've been talking about. Should the RBA be quantitative or can it be qualitative?
This gets back to the SPRs, which are safety and performance requirements. So GSPRs are general safety and performance requirements. That's the acronym for the requirement itself. So SPRs stand for safety and performance requirements. I saw that as a question as well too. So should the RBA be quantitative or can it be qualitative? With regards to the assessment of the data, that's why we have the SPRs and why we have those acceptance criteria with upper and lower bounds to assess safety and performance data against those upper and lower bounds. So where able, all assessments should be quantitative in nature. And again, it gets back to the, can you prove it? Can you prove that your device is, the risks are mitigated? Can you prove that that it meets safety and performance as intended criteria as established by the state-of-the-art analysis of the competitive landscape in which your device exists? So once you establish in the state-of-the-art that your device exists within a certain therapeutic landscape and the state-of-the-art performance standards and acceptance criteria of those performance standards is identified looking across the competitive landscape, now you've established the bar in which your device's data, including risk-benefit data, is analyzed back against. So quantitative when at all possible. But qualitative data is if it's qualitative measurements that were collected, for example, on user surveys and PMCF data, user surveys. It's still qualitative data, and you would just need acceptance criteria, ideally, to assess that against that standard. So I hope I answered that question. I think I know where the questioner is going to, is like, well, maybe not all of our data is quantitative. Some of it may be qualitative. What do we do then? And that's a conversation, that's for sure.
Excellent. Our next question, would equivalence to a sponsor-owned marketed device be an accepted way to use a CER for a development device prior to initiating clinical studies?
Would equivalence to a sponsor-owned marketed device be an accepted way to use in a CER for a development device prior to initiating clinical studies. Ooh, I'm not sure I understand the question. Accepted way to, I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry, questioner. I know that you probably want to know the answer to this, but I don't want to answer it because I'm not sure what we mean by it. I apologize.
Let's go ahead, Lori. Let's collect some, we'll work with that questioner to collect some more
Sure.
clarity on that question, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next one for now. Questioner, if you want to go ahead and type in a chat what you're meaning, we can try to get back to that question. But for now, let's go with this one. If a device or an update to a device is so innovative that it could redefine how therapy or a diagnosis will be performed, what is your policy or approach to documenting how a device meets the state of the art in the CER? That's a long one.
It is, but it's very clear. I understand the question, and we actually have written a couple of CERs, worked with a couple of clients that have no direct comparator. Essentially, they exist in a class of their own, essentially, with this new or unique treatment option or technology. So the way that we've approached that is that you establish, all technology and all innovation has a source, right? It is derived from somewhere or something. So that is certainly discussed. And you talk about the therapeutic landscape for the indication, patient population and indication for the device. And you talk about how in the state of the art, you talk about in the maturity of technology section and available treatment options, you talk about all of those, and then you take it up to the bar of the maturity of technology, whatever that is as a standard across for that indication, and then you take it you just simply take it one step further, but see how this technology or innovation built upon that to take it to a different level. Now you're going to be more challenged about having acceptance criteria and standards of performance, but you still have to have performance and safety standards for your technology, regardless of if it's new or unique. It still has to be able to treat and be safe and perform as intended. So you can still derive those data and those acceptance criteria from your competitor data, even if they're the next best thing. Even if you have no direct competitor, you can still derive it from the analysis of the competitive landscape. That's an interesting question. We like working on CERs like that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We're going to go back to an RBA question. If we are supposed to weigh risk against benefit, how can that be done if you say don't commingle risk and benefit analyses?
Well, you do the analysis of risks. You establish all the risks that were reported, and you analyze those risks. Then subsection number 2, you analyze all the report all the benefits that were identified, analyze the benefits, and then in the very last, you make that head-to-head comparison. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? Are there any unidentified risks? And that's where you make your overall conclusion. So you don't commingle the sub-analyses of the risk and benefits, but then you have to put it in, yes, you do have to put in the story in context at the end of the RBA section by doing an overall assessment of the risk-benefit profile.
All right, we're coming up towards the top of the hour, so we're going to take as many questions as you can. We thank you all for asking lots of very good questions. We'll get to as many as possible, and we'll give you some contact information so you can feel free to follow up with us. And as I said, we'll try to follow up with anyone who we haven't answered questions for, but we'll get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. So here's the topic, Lori, that seems to be coming around. There's some confusion on still. Is the CDP and the CEP, or are the CDP and CEP the same?
No. Clinical development plan is an internal document in which the manufacturer describes the clinical development course of that particular device. We started with this. These were our initial clinical trials, or how we developed it. It has technical documentation in it. It has clinical documentation of data, and it moves through that clinical development plan. And if there were any predecessors to it, and that the current device is version number 3, you're talking about the previous versions of the device. That's a CDP that is that describes the development of the manufacturer's activities in developing that device. I apologize, I've got a frog in my throat today. The CEP, the Clinical Evaluation Plan, describes the evaluation of the device in order to meet MDR requirements. So the CEP is a companion document and the plan for the CER itself, the evaluation of the device to see if it meets safety and performance criteria according to MDR standards.
Seems to be a lot of conversation on this topic. We may have to return to that in a future webinar, but let's go ahead and move on to another question we had. How often or what percentage of cases do you encounter situations where analysis of data does not support the manufacturer's hoped for conclusion?
Where analysis of data does not support the manufacturer's hoped for conclusion. Hoped for. I like the wording of the question. How often, what percentage of cases do we encounter situations where during the analysis of the data, the manufacturers, in other words, not supporting the safety and or performance of the device as intended, is not supported? We have encountered that, rarely, less than 5% of cases. There can sometimes be a struggle in a CER to identify sufficient clinical data to establish both the safety and performance of the device. There have been times that notified bodies have come back and said to our clients, yeah, I'm not buying it. I don't buy how you, your equivalence argument. That's a big source of the problem. I don't buy your equivalence argument. Those devices are not equivalent. Therefore, away goes all that data. That's one big potential issue. Or that you've developed, or that the manufacturer has lumped too many disparate devices within and called it a product family, and hoped that they could establish equivalence amongst the devices in a product family, and that a notified body will come back and say, yeah, I agree for the first 5 devices they are equivalent, but you can't sneak in that, that other one over there. It's not equivalent. You have to take it out, and now therefore a CER has to be written for that device alone. So there's a lot of regulatory strategy that we do not participate in with our clients. They certainly know their devices very well, but groupings are important in a CER. And if you try to overreach and lump as many devices as you can within a CER, and in hopes that it will slide through, you might run into problems.
All right, unfortunately, we have a lot of great questions still outstanding, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to our contact information and let you know if you want to contact us for any reason, have any questions you'd like us to address directly, please feel free to contact us, Lori, at that email address. So I want to thank you, Lori, and thank you, our attendees, for joining us today.
And Mark, if I can jump in, as you're saying, thank you to everyone. Again, thank you on the call. And I see in our chat boxes, and you heard me say earlier that we're not regulatory affairs professionals, and we don't always know the nuances of the regulations, as well as our colleagues that work in the manufacturing space do, and our partners that we work with, the scientists that we work with. So I really appreciate when folks give us feedback saying, well, in this section of the MDR, it says this with regards to the CEP, or this regards to the CDP. It does look like we got a lot of questions. It does look like we have a lot of questions about that. And I really appreciate your expert feedback on nuances, because we are the writers, and writers write and form arguments and conclusions and scientific, that's what we do best. And our regulatory partners with our clients do what they do very well, which is help us interpret the regulatory statements in the best way possible for the CER. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Lori. We're now over, so I'm going to go through this quickly. If you're interested in learning more about the content we discussed today, or would like to obtain a free consult after joining us today, you can email us at consult@criterionedge.com. Or if you have any questions, as I said, the webinar has been recorded and will be emailed to you shortly after this webinar. I hope you all have a wonderful day and stay safe out there. Thank you again for attending. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you.